It was really interesting when I was asked to participate in this panel because I never really thought about like the intersection of transportation and food insecurity in Halifax. So we used to always refer to the community fridge as being low barrier, but after reflecting on like the theme of this panel, I'm realizing that it can't really be low barrier, considering we're in a car-centric city and the public transport here is really, really bad. So it's really not low barrier. Yeah, so I'm realizing that like poor transportation can completely cut off access to food, or like a good public transportation system can bridge important food access gaps. Nonprofit food hubs or like food banks are often really inaccessible. So yeah, one day Marina sent me like this TikTok of like a community fridge that was in like the States or something, and we were like, okay, let's do this. So we mobilized a bunch of like our classmates and our friends to get the project going, and somebody donated us a fridge, and we crowdsourced $1,500 to like house the fridge in like this winterized structure with a pantry. And we had asked Glitter Bean Cafe to house the fridge. So we were really lucky in that sense that Glitter Bean Cafe was willing to house it because it's on private property. So HRM can't really do anything about the structure. But what I learned from organizing the community fridge is that people really care and people really want to help. And there's also, what I noticed is that it's not that there's like a lack of political will in people, but that people don't have the social capital or the transportation to like really engage with community. So that was a big thing. There was a lot of people who really wanted to be involved, but they couldn't because like what we really needed was people with cars to help us pick up food and to stock the fridge.
So yeah, I moved here almost 10 years ago in 2014 to study urban planning because I had a fascination with how transportation infrastructure connected people, how it enabled people to build relationships with place and with each other enabled by the infrastructure that connects them. Back in 2017, I was a summer student with another NGO, and there was a provincial department that came to that organization asking us to make maps of high priority bike infrastructure projects across the province. And I spent the summer making maps because of the budget and technology available. I was handing off paper maps. They'd say, these are great, can you add this? And then I'd go back, make and print off new maps, and then at the end of the summer, I realized that the team I was making maps for, their department managed the data I was using to make maps for them. All this data was there and publicly accessible, but only if you knew how to use the software to navigate it. So for the past few years, I built a dashboard to actually be able to explore all of the active transportation plans made by communities across the province to look at, communities have put together these visions of this is the infrastructure that would let us live less car dependent, more walkable, rollable, bikeable, active lives. Let's implement it. But many of these plans just sat on shelves. Many of them weren't publicly available and took a little sleuthing to unearth. But now I've been running a dashboard so that people can pan around the province and see what is our sort of collective vision among communities towards a less car-dependent future, and what is the state of each project in that long-term vision. Generally not great, but little pieces of progress are happening here and there. It took me almost a year to retrace all of this data that would have been put together by consultants making these plans, but because local governments didn't know what the data was, they didn't explicitly ask for it when they sort of defined the scope of work they contracted out. it just disappeared into the ether. And it was faster for me to just spend a year retracing it from scratch. But now that we have that data set, that inventory of here are all of the infrastructure projects identified to make this province more walkable and bikeable, and what stage they're at, I'm hoping to advocate for funding streams based on how much work is out there to do, not how much money do we want to allocate to it without a sense of what it costs. It's been sort of a long road to get to this point, but I'm encouraged by directions the provincial government is taking. There's the provincial active transportation strategy that should be out this fall. Sounds like there's going to be funding streams attached to it, and I really hope there are, because not including HRM, there are over 400 projects and counting that need roughly $100,000 per project for the engineering work to get them shovel ready. And there's a network of over 1,200 kilometers of proposed infrastructure, and at least 1.2 million per kilometer to build it, we got to allocate at least $1 billion, more accounting for inflation over the years it's going to take to build it. But thankfully, we now have a tool for monitoring those incremental steps and showing we're actually getting somewhere with it. For what's budgeted currently, the province only has one dedicated funding stream of $400,000 a year. That is about a third of a kilometer of sidewalk per year under optimal circumstances, not accounting for any like regrading or drainage management you need to account for. Federally, there was a funding stream of $400 million over 5 years. Which, for reference on that, the HRM alone has a backlog of new sidewalk construction projects estimated by the city staff to be between 400 and 600 million. So that's just new sidewalks ready to be built that need funding, nothing to do with maintenance of existing sidewalks and nothing to do with bikes. Just the lower end of that backlog would eat up the entire federal budget for active transportation infrastructure. I guess what keeps me going is like there have been attempts to sort of wrangle the data together before me that just fell apart when funding stopped. So I've tried to do what I can to keep the data sets I maintain as publicly accessible as possible, so that in the event my work runs out of funding, even if it goes dormant for a few years, there's still something someone can pick up and carry the torch with.
I feel like it's important to reiterate, like I'm not from here. I'm not from Halifax. I'm not from Nova Scotia. I'm not from the Maritimes. I grew up in Ontario and I lived there up until I turned 18 and I moved out here. And I also think it's important to say, like, I grew up rurally. I did not take the bus to school because it would have taken 6 hours a day on the bus for me to get to school. So I had a 45-minute drive to school there and back instead. So I kind of grew up in the backseat of a car. Like, I got my license as soon as I could because I didn't have friends where I lived. Like, I had to go into town to visit with people, all that kind of stuff. So I've like lived a very car-centric life. When I moved here, I did not have a car. It was like my first real experience, like being public transportation only. And when I moved here, I was not disabled. I was like able to walk to the grocery store. Like, I walked to work, I could bike to work, all that kind of stuff. Like, it was great because work was only like a 25-minute walk away. But that's like not an option for me. I've got a pair of crutches here today. I also use a manual wheelchair, but not when it's wet like this. because you just get soaked. And that part of my life came in 2020, unrelated to everything else that happened in 2020. But that was like a big, obviously changed my like relationship with transportation a lot. Yeah, so I learned to take the bus really when I moved here, and it was amazing when I moved here because the town that was the town I spent the most time in, the fast buses, the ones that ran the most often, ran every 20 minutes. And the normal buses ran every 40. So it was like, if you miss your bus, you're done. So moving here and like being able to take the bus, and if you were late, another one came in 10 minutes, it was like very exciting for me. Yeah, I got a car for the first time in September, this past September, and I bought it for work, essentially. Like it said in my intro, I work at the Youth Project, and my role is as GSA coordinator, which feels like a big, silly, fancy title to me. I'm just a person. I just do things, and that a lot of that work looks like me going to schools. When I, like, as of right now, no one else who does education at the Youth Project can drive. I am the only one. Like nobody, people are just getting their like learners now. So it like kind of felt needed. So I bought the worst, cheapest car I could find. And I drive it now. Yeah, I'm like, feel really lucky that I am still able to drive. Because as much as transportation, like public transit here is way better than it was where I grew up, it's still not great. I took public transit while I was disabled. I took it in a wheelchair. I still occasionally do, but try to avoid it because it sucks. It's really weird. If you've never taken public transit, like as someone in a wheelchair, it's weird. I'm like, this is no slander to anyone in the room, but like, you know what it's like. The bus stops and it stops for so long, and like something's going on. So you like, oh, look at the front of the bus. What's happening? And if you're the person who's getting on, you're just sitting there and like, hi everybody, hello. It's weird and it's awkward and it's like not super fun, and yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I think like I love having a car, and that feels kind of weird to say because like I know there's all sorts of stuff about cars. They're not great, but it feels really good to me. It feels really important that I have access to it, not just for my job, but like for day to day. Like having this car means that I can go to the grocery store by myself. I live with my partner who goes away in the summer, and that means that like I couldn't really get groceries by myself because like it's too far for me to walk with my crutches. So I would take my wheelchair, and you can get like a backpack's worth of groceries at most. And then I can't be going to the grocery store like every day. It's just not, it's not feasible, you know? So the car has like really opened up my world for that. It's like, it means that I can do so much more. I can be outside so much more because parks are far away, and by the time I get to a park, I'm like, oh, I'm tired and I don't want to do anything. And it feels really important to me because it's like been a big connection within my community. Like, I love having this vehicle because it means that I can drop things off at people's houses. It means that I can pick people up and drive them to appointments. Like, I've got other disabled friends who like don't drive, and I can pick them up and drive them, which is like feels really big because taking the bus really sucks. Yeah, and like for my work, obviously it's really helpful. Like, I do some virtual visits, but like it's not nearly as fun to visit with young folks virtually as it is to like be there in person. It's not at all as engaging. So like being able to like go places and see people is like really nice. It feels really good, and the connection is like much better. Yeah.
You know, it's also important to consider and put things into context a little bit where, you know, workers come sometimes from areas of like a very different environment, and they're used to, you know, movement and going around, and then coming here. And some workers shared with us that they feel that they're kind of like closed up all of a sudden. And it's just a very uncomfortable situation that they are put in. Yeah, so I think, you know, talking about public transportation in general, yeah, I feel there is sometimes a focus on cities and like metro areas. And I think a connection that is important to make here is us living here, you know, a lot of our food that we get is from areas where migrant workers are in rural areas. So sort of, I think it's very important to see this interconnectedness of, you know, folks who are providing our food do not have access to like proper transportation, and their freedoms are very limited in that way. You know, another connection sort of to the city is many workers come here, you know, so I guess to just give a bit of a context, most migrant farm workers come here on closed work permits, which means they can only work in the job that is mentioned in their, and under the employer that is mentioned in their work permit, but also their work permits are usually, I think, up to 8 months. And so, you know, some workers come here, spend the whole 8 months without even seeing Halifax. And they don't have really the agency also the time to come and visit Halifax, whether because they don't have permission or they don't have the means to travel here, because as we know, it's very expensive. And let alone also, you know, some workers don't speak the language. And so it's, you know, difficult for them to navigate how to get here. And as I said, you know, there's like a lot of vulnerability when it comes to that. And so, you know, worries about their safety as well. So, yeah, you know, so, you know, we've heard from workers, you know, more options of transportation for them is something that would help, whether that would be in between areas where they live rurally, or more options to come to Halifax, or bigger areas in other regions such as Yarmouth or New Minas or what have you, you know, something would be helpful. Another thing to mention is, you know, some workers rely on biking as well, and unfortunately there have been examples that we've heard of where biking is not very safe for workers, and, you know, in very unfortunate circumstances that happened in Ontario, it had led to death of workers who were biking. So, you know, maybe this is also a part of a bigger conversation about, you know, biking safety in rural areas. And, the reality is, some people would say, oh, if you can't drive, then why are you living in a rural area? But the reality is it's not an option for many people, to live there. And so improving public transportation and bike safety programs where, that could be improved, and maybe workers could be provided with safe biking equipment, I think is also like another thing that would be helpful.
Make it more friendly to people that are newcomers to the province or city?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's difficult, I think, to think of this now, but I can maybe talk a bit about like my own experience. As I said, just like as a concept, sometimes taking the bus is just like very foreign, and so yeah, I think, like I said, just sort of like certain like programming that could like sort of like show people around, I think would be very helpful in terms of like, oh, this is how you like take the bus. This is maybe like you can check the app and blah blah blah. Sometimes the app is inaccurate. Like don't worry if the bus doesn't show up, because it's likely not going to show up on time, unfortunately. I think that's like one thing, and connects to what I was saying earlier. Like a lot of people, maybe they don't speak English, so like it's important to have all that translated into different languages as well. That way, they're able to navigate it easier without the added language barrier. Wanted to add in terms of like policy change, sort of connects to, having migrant workers in mind is, making like an intentional effort also to consult migrant workers. And yeah, I think that's really, it's a big part, obviously, of like any policy, like consultations and listening from the community. But knowing what we know about the situation that many migrant workers face, sometimes there's like fear of speaking out. So like it has to be a very intentional effort and a very mindful effort that you cannot sort of like I can't find the English term, but you cannot like do very quickly. It has to be mindful and intentional, and yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Again.